Representative Carlson, thank you for joining us. Can you share with us who you are and give us some information about your background?
My career outside the legislature was that of a teacher. I taught social studies, mainly government and economics, through the years. And I come from a family that I would describe, my parents were never politically active as such, but they were regular voters. I don't think they ever missed an election. They followed the issues very closely. And the dinner table discussions were often public policy kinds of things. Both my mother and father very interested in it. There was a time when my mother was active in like the League of Women Voters. And so that was kind of that environment. And when I decided to get active politically myself and run for office, my parents were very enthusiastic about that because they were very interested in one of their children kind of running for office and being influenced by some of their involvement and interest. I'm married. My wife is Carol, and we live in Crystal, and I have 3 adult children, which then translates to 6 grandchildren these days. 2 of my children are married, and one of them is single. So we have in age ranges among the grandchildren 7 to 21. The oldest is in the United States Marines, currently stationed in Okinawa. And 3 of them live in northern Kentucky, just out of Cincinnati. And one kind of fun part of that is that my daughter called and she said, Cooper, that's the name of the youngest one, a year or so ago, Cooper's going to play hockey. And my response was, hockey in Kentucky? And she said, Dad, we live about a mile from a hockey rink. So that kind of surprised me because I don't think hockey was on my radar screen for Kentucky. But the other 3 grew up here in Minnesota, up close to St. Cloud, and were involved with various school activities. And as far as running for the legislature, I ran for the first time in 1972 and was fortunate enough to be elected, and I've been elected each election cycle since. So one other thing that I would point out is that this past summer, sometime in July, Representative Phyllis Kahn, who was elected the same year that I was, we became the longest serving legislators in the history of the Minnesota House of Representatives. There are 2 members that served both in the House and the Senate, and we will surpass them this year, 2016. So then, no matter how you measure it, Representative Kahn and I will be the longest serving. And it was kind of fun. You know, the reporters were calling from around the state and asking questions like, how has the legislature changed in your period of service? And even though I have that long tenure, I have to say that I still thoroughly like serving and like being engaged in public policy. And every legislative session has its own issues, its own personality, if you will, and that kind of keeps me fresh. So issues that I might have dealt with a term or 2 ago, some of them might be similar or the same, but there's always new issues on the horizon and opportunities to become engaged and remain fresh. And that's kind of the social studies teacher in me. You know, when you're teaching social studies, especially government and economics, you know, there are changing issues, changing dynamics, and that always kept me fresh with my teaching as well.
Can you tell us about the legislation you have worked on in the past that you are most proud of?
In the early days, when I was in the legislature, I was heavily involved with health and human service issues. I chaired a committee that was called the Model Committee on Healthcare, and that was very early in my career. And I have to say, though, even though because I chaired that model committee, and that was a joint Senate committee that we ultimately reported to the full Health and Human Service Committee, but We did have special funding for the committee, and the idea behind it was it would be a joint venture with House and Senate together, so it was kind of unique in that way. There was a senator, Senator John Milton, that was my counterpart in the Senate. So heavily involved with Health and Human Services, but I always want to point out that very few legislators are going to be focused on just a single issue. Even though I chaired a healthcare committee, I was very interested and involved with education issues, for example, environmental issues. They were always very important to me. And I would have to say, even though the issues from those days in the early part of my career, the specific issues in areas like that have changed, but the overall issues are the same. We're still talking about what we can do to deliver the best healthcare system possible and to make sure that everybody has the opportunity for health insurance and that it's affordable. And you know, those are issues that we're still talking about today. And over time, the issues have evolved. Education, every session is an issue. For probably, I don't know, 16 to 18 years, I chaired one education committee or another. And so had an opportunity to focus in those roles on both K-12 education and higher education. When you ask some of the things that I'm most proud of, one of the things that I was involved in the early 90s was getting the first all-day kindergarten sites started. And at the time, one of the members in the Senate on the other side of the aisle said, Representative Carlson, I think what you want to do in the end is make sure that we have all-day kindergarten available for all students. And I said, well, that's not a secret. That's my goal. But right now, we only have the resources to do a limited number of sites, so we're going to get it started. I didn't realize at the time it was going to take about 20 years before we finally passed universal all-day kindergarten. And today, I'm very interested in early childhood education. And one of the big issues that's facing the state of Minnesota is the achievement gap. And I'm absolutely convinced one thing, along with other things that we are going to perhaps have to do to address the achievement gap, but I think early childhood education and all-day kindergarten, which is now implemented, will contribute greatly to reducing the achievement gap. And I was at a meeting a while back, and there was a presentation by the St. Louis Park Public Schools, and they said all-day kindergarten had been so successful that they were having to rewrite their first grade curriculum. And at another meeting where they were there, I asked how they were coming with the rewriting of their curriculum for first grade, and they said, well, it's really, we're rewriting our curriculum through all grade levels because we can see that the students are much better prepared and are going to be much more successful. And so I think that's one of the areas that hopefully we'll be working on this upcoming legislative session will be the achievement gap and the role of early childhood education within that, although I always say we can't forget the students that are currently in the system. And I think there are some things that we can do there too to help them achieve at a higher level than what they are currently.
Who inspires you, and what do you find inspirational about him or her?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I mentioned my parents, and so the one that I would point to, and I could say either my mother or my father, quite frankly, but Dad was maybe a little more outspoken about some of his political philosophy and so on, and he probably influenced my political philosophy as much as anybody. I could point to public office holders that were quite inspirational. When I first ran, you know, a big name in Minnesota was Hubert H. Humphrey, you know, the former U.S. Senator and Vice President of the United States, presidential candidate. But probably the one that influenced my personal political philosophy was my father. And when I mention education, even when Dad was an older citizen and his children were growing and so on, I don't think he would have ever voted against a bonding bill or anything. And his comments would be, it's for the children, it's for the kids. And when we would sometimes be debating things here in the legislature that would impact on families and children, if I was out visiting my parents, my dad would always give me some advice when I was leaving, and he'd say, on a given issue, he'd say, now Lyndon, remember, it's for the children, it's for the kids. You know, that was just, he was just very strong on promoting education. And I think one of the things that he was proudest of, and he was proud of all 5 of his children, was that 2 of us ended up as teachers. And that's the priority that he put on education. And I do have to say he was a working man. I mean, he worked for the railroad. His entire career, he had graduated from high school. The other thing that I find inspirational was even when my siblings and I went on to college, if we were turning in a term paper, guess who was the good grammarian and the good speller was Dad with his high school diploma. I think he was a product of the 1930s, and that greatly influenced his political philosophy, and I think to a degree that influenced what his opportunities were. And I think he probably would have, at a different time, gone on to college and probably been very successful. Not that he wasn't successful in his own life as it was, but he was quite inspirational in that regard. So here I am at my age and in my 22nd term, and who was the greatest influence? Dad, many years ago.
Well, Representative Carlson, thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome.